The summer sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty trail as Jacob Morrison guided his empty wagon toward Redemption Creek. It was August 1882, and the drought had turned his once green ranch into a cracked brown wasteland. His cattle were getting thinner by the day, and if he didn't find grain soon, he'd lose everything he'd spent years building. The wagon wheels creaked and groaned with every bump in the road. Jacob wiped the sweat from his forehead with his worn sleeve and squinted at the horizon. He'd been traveling since dawn, and the town was finally coming into view. It wasn't much to look at. Just a small collection of wooden buildings clustered along a single main street, but right now it represented his only hope. As he drove closer, Jacob could make out the details of the town. There was a general store with a faded sign, a saloon where he could already hear piano music drifting through the open doors, a small white church with a crooked steeple, and scattered around these were a few other buildings that had clearly seen better days. The whole place had that tired, dusty look that every frontier town seemed to have during a drought. Jacob directed his horses toward what looked like a feed and grain shop. His pockets weren't exactly heavy with money, but he'd saved up enough to buy what his cattle needed. At least he hoped he had. Prices had been climbing steadily for months now, and he had no idea what to expect. That's when he first noticed her. A woman dressed entirely in black stood outside the general store, talking to a portly merchant who looked irritated by her presence. Even from a distance, Jacob could tell she was haggling over something, probably prices. Her voice carried across the dusty street, firm and clear, despite the weariness that seemed to cling to her like her mourning dress. The merchant waved his hand dismissively at her, clearly done with the conversation. The woman straightened her shoulders, a gesture of pride that refused to bend even in the face of dismissal. She turned sharply and began walking away, her worn boots kicking up small clouds of dust with each determined step. Jacob was just pulling his wagon to a stop when she walked right into his path. She looked up, startled, and for a brief moment their eyes met. Hers were the color of storm clouds, gray and deep, filled with a strength that seemed to battle against exhaustion. There was something in that gaze that struck him, though he couldn't quite name what it was. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, her voice softer now than when she'd been arguing with the merchant. "I wasn't watching where I was going." "No harm done, ma'am," Jacob replied, tipping his hat. He wanted to say more, to ask if she was all right, but she'd already hurried past his wagon and was walking down the street toward the edge of town. He watched her go, noting the straight line of her back despite whatever burden she clearly carried. Jacob shook his head, trying to clear his thoughts. He wasn't here to wonder about mysterious widows. He had business to attend to. He climbed down from his wagon, his legs stiff from the long ride, and secured his horses before heading into the grain shop. The inside of the shop was dim and dusty, lit only by the sunlight filtering through the grimy windows. The smell of hay and grain filled his nostrils. Behind a rough wooden counter stood a heavy-set man with thinning hair and suspicious eyes. This must be Hoskins, the owner Jacob had heard about from other ranchers. "Help you?" Hoskins asked, not bothering with pleasantries. "Need to buy grain for my cattle," Jacob said, approaching the counter. "Got about 30 head that need feeding through the winter." "What are your prices?" Hoskins named a figure that made Jacob's stomach drop. It was nearly triple what he'd paid last year. He tried to negotiate, but the shopkeeper just shook his head. The drought had hit everyone hard, and those who had grain to sell knew they could demand whatever they wanted. Jacob did some quick calculations in his head. With what he'd brought, he could buy maybe half of what he needed. It would keep his cattle alive, but barely. He'd have to find another source or watch his herd starve come winter. "I'll take what I can get," Jacob said finally, counting out his money with reluctant fingers. As Hoskins began measuring out the grain, he mentioned casually, "If you're looking for equipment or maybe some extra grain, you might talk to the Hartwell widow. She's selling off her late husband's things. Poor woman's desperate enough that you could probably get a good deal." Jacob's ears perked up. "The woman in black? I just saw her outside. That'd be her. Eliza Hartwell. Her man died about 6 months back. Left her with a farm she can't manage and debts piling up higher than hay bales. She's been trying to sell off everything that isn't nailed down." Hoskins shook his head, though whether in sympathy or judgment, Jacob couldn't tell. Shame, really. But that's what happens when a woman tries to run a farm alone. Jacob felt a flash of irritation at the man's tone, but he kept it to himself. As he helped load the grain into his wagon, his mind kept wandering back to the woman, to Eliza. He knew what it was like to struggle, to feel like everything was slipping through your fingers no matter how hard you worked. By the time he finished loading, the afternoon was wearing on. Jacob knew he should probably find a room at the boarding house and start the journey home tomorrow. But instead, he found himself asking one of the locals for directions to the Hartwell place. The farm was on the eastern edge of town, a modest spread with a small house that had once been painted white, but was now mostly bare wood. The barn leaned slightly to one side and the fences were in desperate need of repair. But the land itself was decent, and Jacob could see the remnants of what had probably been a nice vegetable garden before the drought. He tied his horses and approached the house, his boots heavy on the wooden porch steps. Before he could knock, the door swung open. Eliza stood there, and this time she wasn't alone. A rifle rested against the wall within easy reach, and her hand stayed close to it. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice neutral but her eyes wary. Jacob removed his hat and tried to look as non-threatening as possible. "Ma'am, my name is Jacob Morrison. I'm a rancher from about 30 miles north. I heard in town that you might be selling some farm equipment, maybe some grain if you have any to spare. I'm looking to buy." Eliza studied him for a long moment, her storm-gray eyes searching his face for something. Whatever she saw there must have satisfied her because her shoulders relaxed slightly. "You'd better come in then," she said, stepping back from the door. "We can talk business over coffee. I don't have much, but I do have that." Jacob followed her into the small house, noting the clean but sparse interior. Everything spoke of someone trying to hold on to dignity, while the world crumbled around them. It was a feeling he understood all too well. As Eliza busied herself with the coffee pot, Jacob sat at the worn kitchen table and tried not to stare. There was something about this woman that drew him in, something beyond her obvious struggle or those striking gray eyes. Maybe it was the way she moved with purpose despite her exhaustion, or the pride that kept her back straight even when the world seemed determined to break her. Whatever it was, Jacob had a strange feeling that he'd ridden into Redemption Creek looking for grain, but had found something else entirely. Something that might just change everything. The coffee was weak, stretched thin to make the supply last longer, but it was hot and Jacob appreciated the gesture. He sat across from Eliza at her small kitchen table, both of them sizing each other up like poker players trying to read their opponent's hand. Eliza poured herself a cup and sat down, her movements careful and deliberate. "So, Mr. Morrison, what exactly are you looking for?" "Please call me Jacob," he said, warming his hands on the cup despite the summer heat outside. "I'm looking for equipment mainly. A plow if you have one, maybe some tools, and grain if you've got any to sell. The drought hit my place hard. I've got cattle that won't make it through winter without feed." Eliza nodded slowly, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup. "The drought hit everyone. My husband Thomas, he worked himself to death trying to keep this place going. Literally worked himself to death." Her voice didn't waver, but Jacob saw the pain flash across her face. "He caught pneumonia last winter and never recovered. Too weak from all those months of fighting with dry soil and dying crops." "I'm sorry for your loss," Jacob said, and he meant it. He knew that kind of loss, that kind of emptiness. "Thank you." Eliza looked up at him, those gray eyes studying him again. "I do have equipment. A plow, some hand tools, a few other things. Thomas took good care of his tools even when everything else was falling apart. And I have some grain stored in the barn. Not a lot, but enough that I can spare some." They began discussing prices, and Jacob was surprised by her business sense. She knew the value of what she had, and she wasn't about to be cheated just because she was desperate. He found himself respecting that. Too many people would try to take advantage of a widow in her situation. "The problem is," Eliza said after a while, "I can't really afford to sell the grain too cheap. I need money to pay off debts or the bank is going to take this place. But I also need help around here that I can't afford to hire." She paused, seeming to weigh her next words carefully. "What if we worked out a trade?" Jacob leaned forward, interested. "What kind of trade?" "I noticed when you rode up that you know your way around a ranch. You've got working hands, not a shopkeeper's soft palms." Eliza set down her coffee cup with a decisive click. "The barn is falling apart. The fences are barely standing, and I've got equipment that needs fixing. I can't do it all myself, and I can't afford to pay someone. But if you were willing to help with some of the heavy work, I could let you have the grain at a better price. Maybe throw in some of the equipment too." Jacob considered this. He'd planned to head home tomorrow, but the more he thought about it, the more sense Eliza's proposal made. He'd save money on the grain, get equipment he needed, and help someone who clearly needed help. Plus, if he was being honest with himself, the idea of spending a few more days around Eliza Hartwell didn't bother him one bit. "How much work are we talking about?" he asked. Eliza stood and gestured toward the window. "Come look." They walked outside together and she showed him around the property. The barn really was in bad shape. The roof had several holes and one of the support beams had cracked. The fences sagged in multiple places and the gate to the corral hung crooked on broken hinges. There was also a wagon with a busted wheel sitting behind the barn. "I'd say 4, maybe 5 days of work," Jacob estimated, mentally cataloging everything that needed attention. "I'd have to go into town for some supplies, nails and such. But most of it is just labor and know-how. 5 days of your work for grain at half the going rate, plus you can have the plow and whatever tools you need," Eliza offered. "Does that sound fair?" Jacob did the math in his head. It was more than fair. It was generous, actually. But looking at Eliza's face, he could see this wasn't just about business for her. It was about pride, about not accepting charity, about making her own way even when the world seemed stacked against her. "It's a deal," he said. Extending his hand, Eliza shook it firmly, her grip stronger than he expected. "Good, when can you start?" "Tomorrow morning, if that works for you. I'll need to get a room in town for the next few nights and pick up those supplies. There's a boarding house on Main Street. Mrs. Chen runs it. Tell her I sent you and she'll give you a fair rate." Eliza walked him back toward his wagon. "Come at sunrise. We'll get an early start before the heat gets too bad." As Jacob climbed onto his wagon and took up the reins, Eliza called out to him, "Jacob, thank you for treating this like a real business deal and not some act of charity. Not many men would do that." "You're welcome, Eliza." He tipped his hat to her. "I'll see you at sunrise." The ride back into town felt different somehow. The same dusty street, the same tired buildings, but everything seemed a little brighter. Jacob found the boarding house easily enough. Mrs. Chen was a small, no-nonsense woman who gave him a room on the second floor with a decent bed and a wash basin. She didn't ask questions, just took his money and told him breakfast was at 6. That night, lying in the unfamiliar bed and listening to the sounds of the town outside his window, Jacob found himself thinking about Eliza. There was something about her that reminded him of himself, something in the way she refused to give up even when giving up would have been easier. She'd been dealt a hard hand, losing her husband and being left with a failing farm, but she wasn't folding. She was playing the cards she had with skill and determination. He thought about his own place 30 miles north. It had been lonely there since his wife Rose died 3 years ago. She'd passed during childbirth, taking their baby with her, and Jacob had thrown himself into the work of the ranch to avoid the silence of the house they'd built together. He'd convinced himself that work was enough, that keeping busy was the same as living, but sitting across from Eliza tonight, talking about crops and cattle and the price of grain, he'd felt something he hadn't felt in years. He'd felt alive. Not just existing, not just surviving, but actually alive and present in the moment. Jacob rolled over and punched his pillow into a more comfortable shape. He was being foolish, he told himself. He'd known this woman for all of 2 hours. She was a widow still in mourning, and he was a rancher with a struggling spread. They'd made a business deal, nothing more. But as he drifted off to sleep, his last thoughts were of storm-gray eyes and a firm handshake, of a woman who stood straight, even when the world tried to push her down. And he found himself looking forward to sunrise in a way he hadn't looked forward to anything in a very long time. Tomorrow he'd start fixing fences and barns. But something told him that maybe, just maybe, he might be fixing more than that. Maybe he'd be fixing the broken parts of himself that he'd forgotten could be mended. The thought should have scared him. Instead, it filled him with something that felt dangerously close to hope. Jacob arrived at Eliza's farm just as the sun was painting the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold. He'd stopped at the general store first thing and bought the supplies he'd need for the repairs. The same merchant who'd been rude to Eliza yesterday had been perfectly pleasant to him, which only made Jacob's jaw tighten with irritation. Eliza was already up, waiting on the porch with 2 cups of coffee. She handed him one as he approached, and they stood together in comfortable silence watching the sunrise and sipping the hot liquid. It felt natural, like they'd been doing this for years instead of meeting just yesterday. "Figured we'd start with the barn roof," Jacob said after a while. "It's the most urgent. If we get a rain, everything in there will be ruined. Rain, Eliza said with a slight smile. Haven't seen that in so long I almost forget what it looks like. They got to work as soon as it was light enough to see properly. Jacob set up a ladder and climbed onto the barn roof while Eliza handed up supplies. The work was hot and hard, but there was a satisfaction to it. Every nail driven, every board replaced was progress. It was fixing something, making it better, and Jacob had forgotten how good that could feel. Around mid-morning, Eliza called up to him. I'm going to fix us something to eat. Come down when you're ready for a break. Jacob finished securing the board he was working on and climbed down. His shirt was soaked with sweat and his muscles ached in a good way. He washed up at the pump outside before heading into the house. Eliza had set out bread, cheese, and some dried apples. Simple food, but it tasted like a feast after the morning's work. They ate mostly in silence at first, both too hungry and tired to make conversation. But as the food revived them, they began to talk. How long have you had your ranch? Eliza asked, pouring them both water from a pitcher. About 8 years now. Bought the land with money I'd saved from working other people's ranches. My wife Rose and I, we built that place from nothing. Jacob paused, surprised at how easily her name had come out. He rarely talked about Rose anymore. She died 3 years back, childbirth. The baby didn't make it either. Eliza's hand stilled on her cup. I'm sorry, Jacob, that's a terrible loss. It was. He looked down at his weathered hands. For a long time I just worked. Sunrise to sunset until I was too tired to think. It was easier than dealing with the emptiness of that house. I understand that, Eliza said softly. After Thomas died, I threw myself into trying to keep this place running. Didn't matter that I was too small to handle the plow by myself or that I didn't know half of what needed doing. I just worked until I couldn't see straight. Because when you stop working, you have to feel everything, and feeling everything is terrifying. Jacob looked up at her, struck by how perfectly she'd put into words what he'd been living with for 3 years. Exactly. It's like if you stop moving, the grief will catch up with you and pull you under. But it catches up anyway, Eliza continued, just in different ways. It shows up in the middle of the night when you can't sleep, or when you're doing some ordinary task and suddenly remember that they'll never be there to do it with you again. They sat in silence for a moment, both lost in their own memories. Then Eliza spoke again, her voice stronger now. Thomas was a good man. He worked himself harder than anyone should work, always trying to prove that we could make it out here. He wanted to build something lasting, something we could be proud of. I think that's what killed him in the end, that drive to prove himself. He wouldn't rest even when his body was begging him to. Rose wanted children so badly, Jacob found himself saying. She came from a big family and she always talked about filling our house with kids. When she got pregnant, she was so happy. But the birth went wrong and there wasn't a doctor close enough. He swallowed hard. I held her hand while she died and there wasn't a thing I could do to stop it. Eliza reached across the table and placed her hand over his. It was a simple gesture, but it carried weight. Understanding. Shared pain. We're quite a pair, aren't we? She said with a sad smile. 2 people who worked so hard to outrun grief that we forgot how to live. Maybe, Jacob agreed. Or maybe we're 2 people who are finally ready to stop running. The afternoon passed in more work and more conversation. Jacob found himself telling Eliza things he hadn't told anyone. Stories about Rose and their dreams for the ranch. About the loneliness that had become his constant companion. And Eliza shared her own stories about Thomas and their struggles. About the town's whispers and judgment. About her determination to hold on to this farm even though everyone expected her to fail. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, they surveyed the day's work. The barn roof was done, solid and waterproof. It was a good day's work, and they were both tired in that pleasant way that comes from honest labor. Stay for dinner, Eliza said suddenly. It's nothing fancy, just stew from what I had on hand. But you've worked hard all day, and it seems wrong to send you back to town on an empty stomach. Jacob knew he should probably decline. The town gossips were likely already talking about him working out here all day. Having dinner alone with a widow would only fuel more talk. But looking at Eliza's face, seeing the loneliness there that probably mirrored his own, he found himself nodding. I'd like that, he said simply. They ate by lamplight at her kitchen table. The stew thin but flavorful, the bread homemade and still warm. They talked about everything and nothing, favorite books they'd read, places they'd dreamed of seeing. Small memories from childhood that suddenly seemed important to share. Jacob told her about learning to ride from his father, about the first time he'd broken a wild horse. Eliza described growing up in a small town in Missouri, about her mother's garden and the way her father used to play fiddle on Saturday nights. "Do you ever regret coming west?" Jacob asked. Eliza considered this, her fingers wrapped around her coffee cup. "Sometimes, especially now when everything seems so hard. But then I think about what my life would have been if I'd stayed. Probably married to some shopkeeper, living a small, safe life. And as hard as this is, at least it's mine. I chose it. That has to count for something." "It counts for a lot," Jacob said. "More than most people realize." As the night grew late, Jacob finally stood to leave. "I should get back to town before it gets too dark." Eliza walked him outside to his wagon. The night air was cooler now, and stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. "Thank you, Jacob. Not just for the work, but for the conversation. For understanding." "Thank you too," he replied. "I didn't realize how much I needed to talk about these things until tonight." He climbed onto his wagon, but before he could take up the reins, Eliza spoke again. "Jacob, you asked me if I regret coming west. Can I ask you something?" "Of course. Do you regret loving your wife, even though losing her hurt so much?" Jacob thought about this carefully. "No, never. The pain of losing her is terrible, but the years I had with her were worth it. Love is always worth it, even when it ends in heartbreak." Eliza nodded slowly as if he'd confirmed something she needed to know. "I think so too. Good night, Jacob." "Good night, Eliza." As he drove back toward town under the emerging stars, Jacob felt lighter somehow. Talking about Rose, about his grief, about his loneliness hadn't made it worse like he'd always feared. Instead, it had somehow made it more bearable. Sharing the weight with someone who understood had lifted some of the burden. And more than that, he'd enjoyed simply being with Eliza. Her company, her conversation, her quiet strength. He'd come to Redemption Creek for grain, desperate and alone. But somehow, in this small, dusty town, with this determined widow who refused to be broken, he'd found something unexpected. He'd found hope, not just for his ranch, but for himself. And that was worth more than all the grain in the world. The next 3 days fell into a comfortable rhythm. Jacob would arrive at dawn, and Eliza would be waiting with coffee. They'd work together until the heat became unbearable around midday, then rest in the shade while eating lunch. Afterward, they'd tackle easier tasks during the hottest hours before returning to the heavy work as the afternoon cooled. What surprised Jacob most was how well they worked together. He'd initially assumed he'd be doing the work while Eliza watched or maybe helped with small tasks. But she proved him wrong quickly. When he started repairing the corral fence, she was right there beside him, holding posts steady while he drove them into the hard ground. She might not have his strength, but she had determination and a willingness to learn. "Thomas never really taught me much about the heavy work," she explained one afternoon as they worked together fixing a section of fence. "He meant well, trying to protect me from the hard labor. But now I wish I'd insisted on learning. It would have made things easier after he died." "You're learning now," Jacob pointed out, showing her the proper way to wrap wire. "And you're good at it. You've got steady hands." Eliza smiled at the compliment, a real smile that lit up her whole face. Jacob found himself working to earn more of those smiles. They transformed her, making her look younger, less burdened. On the third day, they tackled the broken wagon wheel. It was intricate work requiring patience and precision. They sat together in the barn's shade, working side by side on the complicated repair. Their hands bumped occasionally as they worked, and each accidental touch seemed to carry an electric current. Jacob found himself stealing glances at her when she was focused on the work. The way she bit her lower lip when concentrating. The small line that appeared between her eyebrows when she was figuring something out. The way she'd blow a strand of dark hair out of her face instead of stopping to pin it back properly. He was in trouble, and he knew it. This was supposed to be a business arrangement, work in exchange for grain. But somewhere between the barn roof and the fence posts, between the shared lunches and evening conversations, it had become something more. At least for him, on the fourth afternoon, as they were taking a break under the old cottonwood tree, Eliza's nearest neighbor stopped by. Mrs. Pritchard was a thin woman with a pinched face that looked like it had never smiled. She rode up in her small buggy and called out before even climbing down, "Eliza Hartwell, I need to speak with you." Eliza's shoulders tensed, but she stood and walked over to greet her neighbor. Jacob stayed under the tree close enough to hear but trying to give them space. "Mrs. Pritchard, what can I do for you?" "It's not what you can do for me, it's what I can do for you," the older woman said, her eyes darting between Eliza and Jacob. "I feel it's my Christian duty to warn you about the talk going around town." "Talk?" Eliza's voice went flat. "About you and that man." Mrs. Pritchard pointed at Jacob without looking at him. "He's been here every day from sunrise to sunset. People are talking, Eliza, saying improper things. Your reputation is being damaged." "My reputation," Eliza crossed her arms. "Tell me, Mrs. Pritchard, what should I do? Should I let my barn collapse? Should I let my fences fall down and my animals wander off? Should I lose this farm because it's not proper for a widow to hire help?" "Hire help?" Mrs. Pritchard's voice dripped with skepticism. "Is that what you're calling it? Because it looks very different from town. A single woman and a single man alone out here all day, every day." "We're working," Eliza interrupted, her voice sharp now. "Mr. Morrison is fixing my property in exchange for grain and equipment. It's a business arrangement, nothing more. And frankly, Mrs. Pritchard, my business arrangements are none of yours or the town's concern. I'm only trying to help, dear. A woman in your position can't afford scandal. A woman in my position can't afford to starve either," Eliza shot back. "If the town wants to gossip, let them. I've got bigger problems than wagging tongues." Mrs. Pritchard sniffed disapprovingly and climbed back into her buggy. "Don't say I didn't warn you. When you're shunned completely, when no decent person will associate with you, remember that I tried to help." After she drove away, Eliza stood very still for a moment, her back to Jacob. He could see her shoulders rise and fall with deep breaths. Finally, she turned around and to his surprise, she was laughing. But it was a bitter, angry laugh. "Did you hear that? My reputation is more important than my survival. I should starve and lose my home, but at least the town would approve." She shook her head. "The same people who won't lift a finger to help me are the ones judging me for finding my own solution." Jacob stood and walked over to her. "I'm making things worse for you. Maybe I should—" "Don't you dare!" Eliza looked up at him fiercely. "Don't you dare apologize for helping me. Don't you dare let small-minded people make you feel wrong for doing a good thing. But if it's hurting you, let me worry about that." Eliza's expression softened slightly. "Besides, Mrs. Pritchard is right about one thing. People are talking, so what? They'll talk anyway. If you left now, they'd say I drove you away because something inappropriate happened. If you stay, they'll assume something inappropriate is happening. Either way, I'm damned in their eyes, so I might as well have a fixed barn and mended fences out of the deal." Jacob wanted to say something to somehow make it better, but words failed him. Instead, he just nodded. "Then we keep working." "We keep working," Eliza agreed. But the conversation had changed something. They were both more aware now of how their situation looked from the outside, of the assumptions people were making. It added a tension that hadn't been there before, a consciousness of every moment they spent together. That evening, as they finished the day's work, Jacob noticed Eliza seemed quieter than usual. They'd repaired the last section of fence that needed immediate attention, and tomorrow would be his final day. The thought sat heavy between them. "Almost done with everything on the list," Jacob said, washing his hands at the pump. "Tomorrow I'll finish up that broken gate and check over everything one last time. Then you'll be all set." "Yes," Eliza said softly. "All set." Neither of them moved toward their evening goodbyes. Instead, they stood in the gathering dusk, both seeming reluctant to end the day. "Can I ask you something?" Eliza finally said. "And I want you to be honest." "Of course. Are you sorry you stopped here? Sorry you got mixed up in all this?" She gestured vaguely, encompassing the farm, herself, the situation. "Because if Mrs. Pritchard came to me, she'll have talked to others in town. This might affect you too, how people see you." Jacob took his time answering, wanting to get it right. "I'm not sorry. Not for a single minute of it. These past few days, working here, talking with you, they've been the best days I've had in 3 years. If the price of that is some gossip, then it's a price worth paying." Eliza's eyes glistened in the fading light. "These have been good days for me too. I'd forgotten what it was like to not be alone. To have someone to share the work and the talk and just the being here." "You don't have to be alone," Jacob said quietly. "Not if you don't want to be." The words hung in the air between them, meaning more than what was actually said. Eliza looked up at him, and for a moment Jacob thought she might say something important. something that would change everything. But instead, she just smiled sadly. "Good night, Jacob. I'll see you tomorrow." "Good night, Eliza." As Jacob drove back to town that night, his mind was full of things unsaid. Tomorrow was his last day. The work would be done and he'd have no more reason to stay. He'd load up his grain and equipment and head back to his lonely ranch 30 miles away, back to his empty house and his solitary life. The thought felt wrong in a way that scared him. In just 4 days, Eliza had become part of his daily routine, someone he looked forward to seeing, someone whose company he'd begun to crave. What would it be like to go back to days without her steady presence, without her quiet strength, without those rare but beautiful smiles? Tomorrow was his last day. But as Jacob lay in bed that night, he found himself wishing it didn't have to be. The 5th day dawned different. Jacob noticed it the moment he stepped outside the boarding house. The air felt heavy, thick with moisture. The sky to the west was dark, not with night but with clouds, real rain clouds stacked tall and promising. Mrs. Chen saw him looking at the sky. "Storm's coming." "First real one in months. Should be here by afternoon." Jacob's heart picked up pace. He needed to get out to Eliza's place. Needed to make sure everything was secured before the storm hit. The work they'd done on the barn would be tested today. He rode faster than usual. And when he arrived, Eliza was already outside, looking at the approaching storm with a mixture of hope and worry on her face. "Rain," she said when she saw him. "Finally, rain. But we need to prepare. If this storm is as big as it looks, we need to secure everything." They worked quickly and efficiently, moving with the kind of coordination that came from days of working side by side. They moved tools into the barn, secured shutters on the house, checked that the animals had shelter, and made sure nothing loose could blow away or get damaged. The wind picked up as they worked, blowing dust and dried leaves across the yard. The sky grew darker by the minute, the clouds rolling in like an advancing army. There was an energy in the air, electric and alive. "We need to get the chickens inside," Eliza called over the rising wind. She ran toward the chicken coop, Jacob right behind her. They were chasing the last few stubborn hens when the first drops fell, big, fat drops that left dark spots on their clothes and in the dust. Then suddenly, as if someone had opened a floodgate in the sky, the rain came down in sheets. Within seconds, they were soaked. Eliza laughed, actually laughed out loud, her face turned up to the sky as the rain poured down. Jacob found himself laughing too, both of them standing in the yard getting drenched, celebrating the rain like children. "We should get inside," Jacob shouted over the sound of rain on the barn roof. They ran for the house, their boots splashing through puddles that were already forming in the hard-packed earth. Eliza fumbled with the door latch, her hands slippery with rain, and then they tumbled inside together, breathless and dripping. For a moment, they just stood there in her small kitchen, water pooling at their feet, breathing hard and grinning at each other like fools. Eliza's dark hair had come loose from its pins and hung in wet strands around her face. Her dress clung to her in a way that made Jacob quickly look away. "Let me get towels," Eliza said, suddenly seeming to realize their state. She hurried to a cabinet and pulled out 2 worn but clean towels, handing one to Jacob. They dried off as best they could, but they were soaked through. The sound of rain pounding on the roof filled the kitchen, steady and relentless and wonderful after months of drought. "Coffee?" Eliza offered. "Though I suppose hot coffee isn't exactly what we need when we're already dripping wet." "Coffee sounds perfect," Jacob said. As Eliza busied herself with the stove, Jacob stood by the window watching the storm. Rain came down so hard he could barely see the barn. Thunder rumbled in the distance, moving closer. Lightning flashed, bright even in the afternoon gloom. "The barn roof held," he observed. "Not a leak in sight." "Thanks to you," Eliza said softly. She brought him a cup of coffee, and when he took it, their fingers brushed. This time, neither of them pulled away quickly. They stood there, almost touching, both suddenly aware of how close they were. "Eliza," Jacob started, not even sure what he wanted to say. "This is your last day," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "After today, you'll go back to your ranch. I'll probably never see you again." "Is that what you want?" "No." The word came out strong and certain. "No, that's not what I want at all." Jacob set down his coffee cup, his heart pounding harder than the rain on the roof. "These past 5 days, I've felt more alive than I have in 3 years. You make me want to stop just surviving and start actually living again." "I know. I feel it too." Eliza looked up at him, those storm-gray eyes reflecting the lightning outside. I've been alone for so long, Jacob. So alone that I forgot what it felt like to have someone who cared whether I succeeded or failed. Someone who saw me as more than just a widow to be pitied or judged. I see you, Eliza. I see your strength, your determination, your kindness. I see a woman who refuses to be broken no matter what life throws at her. And I see you, she replied. I see a good man who's been hurting, who's been hiding from life because the pain of losing someone he loved made the world feel too dangerous. But you're still here, Jacob. Still capable of caring, of helping, of feeling. The air between them felt charged like the lightning dancing outside. Jacob reached up slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted, and gently brushed a wet strand of hair from her face. Eliza's breath caught, but she didn't move away. Instead, she leaned into his touch. I think I'm falling for you, Jacob confessed, his voice rough with emotion, and that terrifies me. Because I know what it's like to lose someone I love, and I don't know if I'm strong enough to risk that kind of pain again. I'm scared too, Eliza admitted. Loving Thomas and losing him nearly destroyed me. The thought of opening my heart again, of being that vulnerable, it feels impossible. But Jacob, being with you this week, I realized something. Not loving again would be a different kind of death. A slower one, but just as final. Thunder cracked overhead so loud it shook the house. Neither of them flinched. They were too focused on each other, on this moment that felt like standing on the edge of a cliff about to either fall or fly. What are we going to do? Jacob asked. I don't know, Eliza said honestly. You have a ranch 30 miles away. I have a farm here that I can't leave. The town already talks about us, and we've known each other less than a week. None of this makes sense. No, it doesn't, Jacob agreed. But it feels right. That has to count for something. Eliza reached up and placed her hand on his chest, right over his heart. It counts for everything. Jacob covered her hand with his own, holding it there. They stood like that for a long moment. The storm raging outside, both of them on the brink of something that could change their lives forever. I don't want to leave tomorrow, Jacob said. I don't want to go back to my empty ranch and pretend these days didn't happen. I don't want to lose this, whatever this is between us. Then don't, Eliza said simply. Stay, not forever, not yet. But stay a few more days. Give us time to figure out what this is, where it could go. The town will really talk then. Let them talk, Eliza said with a flash of the fire he'd come to admire. I'm tired of living my life according to what other people think is proper. I'm tired of being alone because it's more respectable. I want to be happy, Jacob. Is that so wrong? No, he said firmly. It's not wrong at all. They moved closer, drawn together like magnets. When their lips finally met, it was gentle at first, tentative. Both of them afraid to hope too much. But then the kiss deepened, and all the loneliness, all the fear, all the hope they'd been holding back poured into it. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, Eliza rested her forehead against Jacob's chest. What are we doing? Living, Jacob said, his arms wrapped around her. For the first time in years, we're actually living. Outside, the storm continued, the rain washing away months of drought, making the earth new again. Inside, two people who'd thought their chances at happiness had died with their spouses held each other close and dared to hope for a future they hadn't thought possible. The storm raged all evening. Jacob knew he should probably try to make it back to town, but neither of them suggested it. Instead, they made dinner together, moving around the small kitchen with an easy familiarity that felt like they'd been doing this for years instead of days. They ate by lamplight while the rain continued, talking about everything and nothing, stealing glances and soft touches, both of them giddy with the newness of whatever this was between them. As night fell, Jacob finally prepared to head to the barn to sleep. He'd stayed here working late before, bedding down in the hay, but this time as he stood at the door, Eliza caught his hand. Jacob, thank you. For today, for this week, for seeing me. Thank you too, he replied. For reminding me that it's okay to feel again, to want again, to hope again. They kissed once more, soft and sweet, a promise of more to come. Then Jacob went out into the rain to the barn, his heart lighter than it had been in years. He came to Redemption Creek for grain, but lying in the hay that night, listening to the rain on the roof and thinking about storm-gray eyes and a smile that made him believe in second chances, Jacob knew he'd found something infinitely more valuable. He'd found hope, connection, and the possibility of love again. Tomorrow they'd figure out the details, the practical realities of two people with separate lives trying to build something together. But tonight he let himself simply feel grateful. Grateful for the rain, for the chance meeting, for a widow who refused to be broken and who'd somehow helped him put his own broken pieces back together. The storm was a baptism, washing away the old and making way for the new. And Jacob, lying in the dark and listening to the rain, finally felt ready for whatever came next. The morning after the storm dawned clear and fresh, the world washed clean. Jacob woke early in the barn, sunlight streaming through the cracks in the walls, and for the first time in years he woke up smiling. Then reality crashed in and the smile faded. He'd kissed Eliza last night. More than that, he'd admitted feelings that he wasn't sure either of them were ready for. Now in the bright light of morning he had to face what came next. He still had a ranch to get back to, cattle to feed, responsibilities he couldn't ignore. And Eliza had her own farm to manage. When he walked to the house, Eliza was already up making breakfast. She looked up when he entered, and the uncertainty on her face probably matched his own. But then she smiled and some of his worry eased. "Coffee's ready," she said, like this was any other morning. But it wasn't, and they both knew it. They ate in awkward silence at first, both trying to figure out what to say, how to navigate this new territory they'd stepped into. Finally, Jacob couldn't stand it anymore. "We should talk," he said. "Yes, we should." Eliza set down her coffee cup with careful precision. "Last night was wonderful, Jacob. But this morning I keep thinking about all the reasons why this can't work." Jacob felt his heart sink, but he nodded. "Your farm is here. My ranch is 30 miles north. We've known each other less than a week. The whole town is already talking." "Exactly." Eliza looked down at her hands. "I want this, whatever this is between us. But wanting something doesn't make it possible. What if we tried anyway?" Jacob asked. "I could visit when I can, you could. And we'd see each other once a month if we're lucky?" Eliza shook her head. "Jacob, I care about you. More than I should after such a short time. But I won't build my life around waiting. I did enough waiting with Thomas, waiting for rain, waiting for crops to grow, waiting for things to get better. I won't spend my life waiting for stolen moments." Jacob understood, even though it hurt. "So what do we do?" Before Eliza could answer, there was a knock at the door. She got up to answer it, and Jacob heard a man's voice, official and cold. When Eliza returned, she was pale and holding a letter. "What is it?" Jacob asked, standing. "The bank." Eliza's voice was hollow. "I have 30 days to pay what I owe, or they're taking the farm. I thought I had more time, but apparently Thomas had taken out another loan I didn't know about. The payment is due, and I don't have anywhere near what they're asking." She sat down heavily, staring at the letter. Jacob moved to her side, reading over her shoulder. The amount was substantial, more than she could possibly raise by selling equipment or grain. "Maybe you could talk to them, negotiate more time." "I tried that already. Last month. They said 30 days, and that was being generous." Eliza's hands were shaking. "I'm going to lose this place, Jacob. Everything Thomas worked for, everything I've fought to hold on to. It's all going to be taken away." Jacob's mind raced. He had some money saved, but not enough to cover what she owed. His ranch, if he sold it, might bring in enough, but that would take time he didn't have. There had to be another way. "Sell to me," he said suddenly. Eliza looked up, confused. "What? Sell the farm to me? I'll pay off the bank, take over the property. You won't lose it, not completely." "Jacob, you don't have that kind of money. You said yourself you're struggling with the drought. I could borrow against my ranch, or—" He stopped, realizing how complicated that would be, how long it would take. And even if he managed it, Eliza would still lose her home. They sat in defeated silence. Then Eliza spoke, her voice quiet but firm. "There is one way," she said slowly. "One way we could solve both problems. Yours and mine." "What do you mean?" Eliza looked up at him, her gray eyes determined despite the fear he could see behind them. "Marry me." Jacob stared at her, sure he'd misheard. "What?" "Marry me," she repeated, stronger this time. "Think about it, Jacob. Your ranch is struggling. So is my farm. But together we could combine our resources. We could sell your place, use that money to pay off the bank and invest in this farm. Or we could keep both properties, move the cattle here where there's better water. Together we'd have enough land, enough animals, enough of everything to actually succeed." "Eliza, that's practical?" she interrupted. "Yes, it is. I know it's not romantic. I know it's not how either of us imagined getting married again. But Jacob, we're both facing losing everything. This way we both survive. More than survive, we could actually build something. Jacob stood and walked to the window, his thoughts spinning. Marriage. Not for love. Though he was starting to feel something that might be heading that direction. But marriage is a business arrangement, a merger of assets and resources. What about last night? He asked quietly. What about what we felt? Last night was real, Eliza said, coming to stand beside him. What I feel for you is real. But Jacob, feelings don't pay the bank. Feelings don't save a farm. We can't afford to be romantic about this. We need to be smart. And if we get married and it doesn't work out, if we realize we made a mistake, then we'll be in the same position we're in now, except together instead of alone. Eliza took his hand. I'm not asking you to love me, Jacob. I'm asking you to be my partner, to build something with me. And maybe if we're lucky, love will come along the way. Or maybe it won't, and we'll just be two people who helped each other survive. Jacob looked down at their joined hands. Everything about this was backwards. You were supposed to fall in love, then get married, then combine your lives. Not combine your lives out of desperation and hope that love would follow. But when had his life ever followed the proper order? Rose had died when she should have lived. His ranch was failing when he'd done everything right. The world didn't follow the rules people thought it should. Give me time to think, he said finally. This is a big decision, Eliza, for both of us. I know. And I'm sorry to spring it on you like this. But we don't have much time. The bank wants their money in 30 days, and even if you agree, we'd need to move fast. Jacob nodded. I should go into town. Think this through. Can I come back tonight with my answer? Of course. Eliza squeezed his hand before letting go. Jacob, whatever you decide, I understand. You don't owe me anything. You've already done more for me than anyone else in this town. As Jacob rode toward Redemption Creek, his mind was a storm worse than yesterday's rain. Marriage. To a woman he'd known less than a week. It was crazy. Impractical. Rushed. But was it really crazier than spending the rest of his life alone? Was it more impractical than watching both their properties fail? And as for rushed, well, sometimes life rushed you whether you wanted it to or not. In town, Jacob noticed the stares and whispers more than usual. Mrs. Pritchard saw him and actually crossed the street to avoid him. Hoskins at the general store barely acknowledged him. The town had decided he and Eliza were scandals, and nothing he did would change their minds. He went to the boarding house and lay on his bed, staring at the ceiling. Rose's face came to mind, and for the first time in 3 years thinking about her didn't just bring pain. He found himself wondering what she would say about all this. Rose had been practical beneath her romantic dreams. She would have understood the logic of Eliza's proposal. But more than that, she would have wanted him to be happy. She would have wanted him to live, not just exist. What should I do? He whispered to the empty room as if Rose could hear him. The answer came not from memory or imagination, but from his own heart. He'd been given a chance at something real, something that could grow into more than just survival. Eliza was offering him partnership, companionship, and the possibility of building a life together. Yes, it was unconventional. Yes, it was rushed. But it was also honest and brave and exactly what they both needed. As the afternoon shadows grew long, Jacob made his decision. He cleaned up, put on his best shirt, and rode back out to Eliza's farm. She was waiting on the porch, her face anxious. Eliza, he said, dismounting, I've been thinking about your proposal all day. And? She stood, her hands clasped together tightly. I think you're right. It is practical. It does solve both our problems. He climbed the porch steps until he was standing right in front of her. But I need you to know something. I don't want just a business arrangement. I don't want to marry you just to save our farms. Eliza's face fell. Then you're saying no? No, I'm saying yes. But I'm saying yes because I want a real marriage, Eliza. A real partnership. I want to build a life with you, not just a farm. I want the chance for this to be more than practical. I want the chance for us to be happy. Tears filled Eliza's eyes. I want that too. I was trying to be practical because I was afraid to hope for more. But yes, Jacob, yes to all of it. Yes to a real marriage, to a real chance at happiness. They stood on the porch as the sun set, two broken people putting their pieces together, building something new from the ruins of their old lives. It wasn't how either of them had imagined their second chance at love, but maybe that was okay. Maybe the best things in life were the ones you never saw coming. Jacob left Eliza's farm at dawn, his wagon loaded with the grain he'd originally come for, plus the equipment they'd agreed upon. But now those supplies meant something different. They weren't just purchases. They were the beginning of combining two lives, two properties, two futures. The 30-mile journey back to his ranch felt longer than it ever had before. His mind kept circling around the same thoughts. He was going to get married. In less than 2 weeks, if they could arrange it that quickly. He was going to marry Eliza, sell his ranch, and start a completely new life. The rational part of his brain kept whispering that this was insane. You didn't marry someone you'd known for less than a week. You didn't make life-changing decisions based on feelings that were barely a week old. You didn't abandon the home you'd built with your first wife for a woman you'd met by accident in a dusty frontier town. But the other part, the part that had woken up yesterday morning smiling for the first time in 3 years, knew this was right. Strange, yes. Unconventional, absolutely. But right. As his ranch came into view, Jacob felt an unexpected pang. He'd built this place with Rose. Every fence post, every building, every inch of this land held memories of her. They'd arrived here with nothing but dreams and determination, and they'd carved out a life from the harsh wilderness. This was where Rose had hung curtains in the windows for the first time, making their rough cabin feel like a home. This was where they'd celebrated their first successful harvest, dancing in the barn by lantern light. This was where she'd told him she was pregnant, her face glowing with joy. And this was where she'd died, leaving him alone in a place that suddenly felt too big and too empty. Jacob pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the house and just sat there for a moment. Could he really leave this place? Could he really let go of everything he and Rose had built together? "You're being foolish," he muttered to himself. "It's just land. Just buildings," but it wasn't, and he knew it. This place was his last connection to Rose, his last physical link to the life they'd shared. Selling it felt like letting her go completely. His foreman, Pete, came out of the barn and waved. Pete was a good man, tough and reliable, who'd worked for Jacob for 5 years. He'd keep things running while Jacob figured out what to do next. "Boss, good to see you back. Get the grain you needed?" "Yeah, and then some." Jacob climbed down from the wagon. "Pete, I need to talk to you. Something's come up." Over the next few hours, Jacob explained the situation to Pete and the other ranch hands. He was careful about how he told it, focusing on the practical aspects. 2 struggling ranches combining resources. A business arrangement that made sense. He didn't mention Eliza's gray eyes or the way his heart felt lighter when he was near her. The men took it better than he expected. Pete even nodded approvingly. "Makes sense, boss. This drought's been hard on everyone. Sometimes you gotta think smart instead of proud." "I'll need you to keep things running here for a while," Jacob said, "until I can get things sorted out with the sale and the move." "We can handle it," Pete assured him. "You do what you need to do." That evening, Jacob went through the house alone, touching things that Rose had touched, remembering. Her favorite chair by the fireplace. The dishes she'd picked out on a rare trip to the city. The quilt her mother had made them as a wedding present. He picked up the framed photograph of Rose that sat on the mantel. She looked so young in it, so full of hope and dreams. They'd been so certain they had all the time in the world. "I'm sorry," he whispered to her image. "I'm sorry I couldn't save you. I'm sorry I'm moving on. I'm sorry this place wasn't enough to keep me here." But even as he apologized, he knew Rose wouldn't have wanted this. She wouldn't have wanted him to spend the rest of his life trapped in memories, alone in a house full of ghosts. Rose had been full of life, always looking forward instead of back. She would have wanted him to live, to find happiness again, to build a new future. "She's a good woman," he told Rose's photograph. "Strong like you were. Stubborn like you were. I think you would have liked her. I think you would have been friends." He carefully wrapped the photograph and packed it in his saddlebag. He was moving forward, but he wasn't leaving Rose behind. She would always be part of him, part of his story. Eliza understood that. She had her own ghosts, her own past to carry forward. The next 2 days passed in a blur of activity. Jacob met with a land agent about selling the ranch. The drought had depressed property values, but he'd still get enough to pay off Eliza's debts and have something left over to invest in her farm. Their farm, he corrected himself. He sorted through his possessions, deciding what to take and what to leave with the property. Practical items mostly. His tools, his best saddle, his father's rifle, books, a few pieces of furniture that held special meaning. Everything else could stay. Telling his neighbors was harder than he expected. Word spread quickly, and soon people were stopping by to ask if it was true, if he was really selling out and moving away to marry some widow in Redemption Creek. Their reactions ranged from supportive to skeptical to outright judgmental. Old Man Peterson, whose ranch bordered Jacob's to the north, was particularly blunt. "You're making a mistake, son. Marrying in haste, selling your land. This is grief-talking, not sense." "Maybe," Jacob admitted. "Or maybe I'm finally doing something right. Either way, it's my choice to make." "That it is," Peterson conceded. "Just don't blame the rest of us when it all goes south." But others were kinder. Mary Chen, who ran the local store, wished him well. "Sometimes you have to take a leap of faith. I hope this works out for you, Jacob. You deserve some happiness." On the third morning, Jacob woke before dawn and walked his property one last time. He visited every corner, every fence line, every special place. The creek where he and Rose used to fish, the high pasture where they'd watch sunsets, the grave marker he'd placed for her and their baby under the old oak tree. He knelt by the grave, his hand on the rough wood of the cross he'd carved. "I'll always love you, Rose, but I need to let go now. I need to live again. I hope you understand. I hope, wherever you are, you want this for me." The morning breeze whispered through the oak leaves, and Jacob chose to take it as a sign. Rose had always believed in signs, in the universe speaking through small moments. She would have approved of that interpretation. By mid-morning, he had his best horses hitched to the wagon, everything he was taking loaded and ready. Pete and the other hands gathered to see him off, and there was a moment of awkward silence before Pete stepped forward and shook his hand. "Good luck, boss. Hope it all works out for you and your new wife." "Thanks, Pete. Take care of things here until the sale goes through." As Jacob drove away from his ranch, he looked back only once. The house, the barn, the corrals, all of it getting smaller in the distance. Part of him wanted to turn around, to call off this crazy plan and stay in the safety of the familiar. But he didn't. He kept the horses moving forward, toward Redemption Creek, toward Eliza, toward an uncertain future that was at least a future instead of just an endless present of grief and isolation. The journey took most of the day. The landscape gradually changed from the familiar to the less known. Every mile brought him closer to a new life, and with each mile, Jacob felt his nervousness grow. What if Eliza had changed her mind? What if she'd realized how crazy this whole plan was? What if the town had pressured her into backing out? But when Redemption Creek finally came into view in the late afternoon sun, and when he saw Eliza's small farm on the edge of town, his heart settled. He could see her in the yard hanging laundry. She must have heard his wagon because she turned, and even from a distance he could see her freeze. Jacob guided his horses toward her farm, his pulse pounding in his ears. This was it. The point of no return. He was either about to start the best chapter of his life or make the biggest mistake he'd ever made. Eliza stood perfectly still, a wet sheet in her hands, watching him approach. Her face showed everything he was feeling: hope, fear, uncertainty, determination. When he pulled the wagon to a stop and climbed down, they just stared at each other for a long moment. "You came back," Eliza finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I told you I would." Jacob walked toward her slowly. "Eliza, I sold my ranch. Or I will, as soon as the papers are finalized. I brought everything I'm keeping. Everything I need to start over." Tears welled up in her eyes. "Are you sure?" "This is your life, Jacob, your home. I don't want you to resent me for this." "I won't." He reached her and took her hands in his. "That ranch was my past, Eliza. You're my future. And I choose the future." She dropped the sheet and threw her arms around him, holding tight. Jacob held her just as tightly, and in that moment he knew he'd made the right choice. It was terrifying and uncertain and completely backwards from how things were supposed to go, but it was right. It was real. And it was the first truly alive decision he'd made since the day Rose died. "Let's build something together," he whispered into Eliza's hair. "Let's take our broken pieces and make something whole." "Yes," she said. "Yes, let's do exactly that." The wedding took place the following week in the small white church at the center of Redemption Creek. It wasn't the grand affair either of them had experienced with their first marriages. There was no time for that, and honestly, neither of them wanted it. This wedding was about practicality as much as promise, about survival as much as love. Eliza wore a simple blue dress, not white. She'd been married before, and white felt wrong anyway. Jacob wore his best suit, the one he'd worn to Rose's funeral, but he'd had Mrs. Chen help him pick out a new shirt so it wouldn't carry only sad memories. The church was nearly empty. Mrs. Chen came, and a few of the shopkeepers who'd been kind to Eliza over the months of her widowhood. Pete had ridden down from Jacob's ranch to stand as witness. Most of the town, though, stayed away. The gossip had only grown worse when word spread that they were actually going through with marriage after knowing each other barely 2 weeks. Mrs. Pritchard had made her opinions loudly known throughout town. It was scandalous. It was improper. It was an insult to both their late spouses. A decent person would wait at least a year, probably 2, before even thinking about remarrying, and to marry a stranger, someone you'd known mere days. It was indecent. But as Jacob stood at the altar and watched Eliza walk down the aisle alone, no father to give her away, he didn't care what anyone thought. She was beautiful, even in her simple dress, even with worry lines around her eyes. She was strong and brave and willing to take this leap of faith with him. The ceremony was short. Reverend Collins kept it traditional, his tone slightly disapproving even as he performed his duty. When it came time for the vows, Jacob and Eliza looked at each other with complete honesty. They both knew what this was: a practical arrangement, a business partnership, a chance at survival. But when Jacob said "I do," he meant more than just accepting the legal arrangement. He was promising to try to give this a real chance, to see if practical partnership could grow into something deeper. And when Eliza said "I do," her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes, he knew she was promising the same thing. "You may kiss the bride," Reverend Collins said, sounding like he hoped they wouldn't. Jacob leaned in and kissed Eliza gently, carefully aware of the few watching eyes. It wasn't like their kiss during the storm, full of passion and possibility. This was quieter, more serious, weighted with the reality of what they'd just done. When they pulled apart, they were married. For better or worse, their lives were now legally and permanently intertwined. The small group gathered afterward outside the church. Mrs. Chen had brought cake, and Pete produced a bottle of whiskey for toasts. It was a modest celebration, but it was genuine. The few people who'd come were the ones who actually cared about their happiness, not just their scandal. "To new beginnings," Pete said, raising his glass. "May they lead to good endings." They drank to that, and then the small party dispersed. Most people had work to get back to, lives to attend to. Jacob and Eliza were left standing outside the church in the afternoon sun, newly married and slightly awkward about what came next. "Well," Eliza said with a nervous laugh, "we're married now." "Yes, we are," Jacob agreed, feeling equally uncertain about what happened next. They'd been so focused on getting to this point that they hadn't really discussed what came after. "We should probably go home," Eliza said, then blushed. "I mean to the farm." "Our farm. Our farm." The words settled over Jacob with a weight that was both heavy and comforting. He wasn't alone anymore. Neither of them was. Whatever came next, they'd face it together. The weeks that followed were a blur of activity and adjustment. The money from selling Jacob's ranch came through just in time to pay off Eliza's debts to the bank. The relief on her face when she handed over that payment was something Jacob would never forget. She'd been carrying that burden for so long, the fear of losing everything, and now it was gone. With the remaining money, they invested in the farm. They bought lumber to properly repair the barn and outbuildings. They purchased more chickens, a few pigs, and eventually brought Jacob's cattle down from his old ranch. Pete helped with the move and then decided to stay on as their hired hand. He was getting older and liked the idea of a smaller operation. The physical work of combining their lives was actually easier than the emotional work. They were two people used to being alone, used to making decisions without consulting anyone, used to their own rhythms and routines. Now they had to learn to share space, share decisions, share a life. Some nights they barely spoke during dinner, both exhausted from work and unsure how to navigate this strange new relationship. Other times they'd sit up late talking, sharing stories from their pasts, slowly learning each other's histories and habits. Jacob learned that Eliza sang while she worked, old songs her mother had taught her. She learned that he liked to read before bed, and that he had a sweet tooth he tried to hide. He discovered she was afraid of thunderstorms despite pretending not to be. She realized he still sometimes called for Rose in his sleep and she never mentioned it, understanding that grief didn't follow neat timelines. The town's attitude remained cold. Women crossed the street to avoid Eliza. Men gave Jacob curt nods instead of friendly greetings. They were the scandal that wouldn't die down, the couple who'd done things all wrong and didn't have the decency to be ashamed of it. But gradually, as weeks turned into months, something shifted. The townspeople began to see that this wasn't some sordid affair that would burn out quickly. Jacob and Eliza worked side by side every day, building their farm into something profitable. They attended church every Sunday, sat in the same pew, and held their heads high despite the whispers. More importantly, they started to succeed. The rain that had come the day of the storm was followed by more rain. The drought finally broke, and with it, their combined resources and hard work began to pay off. Their crops grew, their animals thrived. While other farms struggled with debt, Jacob and Eliza's farm prospered. Success has a way of changing people's opinions. Suddenly, their hasty marriage seemed less scandalous and more shrewd. They'd combined struggling operations and created something stronger. They'd seen an opportunity and taken it. That was just good business sense, wasn't it? Mrs. Chen was the first to fully accept them, inviting them for dinner one evening. "I always thought you two made sense," she said over coffee. "Life's too short to wait for perfect timing. Sometimes you have to make your own timing." Others slowly followed. Not everyone, and some people would probably judge them forever. But enough. Enough that Eliza could go to the general store without enduring hostile silence. Enough that Jacob could have a conversation at the feed shop without feeling like he was being condemned. 6 months into their marriage, on a cool autumn evening, Jacob and Eliza sat together on their porch watching the sunset. It had become their routine, this quiet time together at the end of each day. They'd work until they couldn't see, clean up, eat dinner, and then sit together as the day ended. "I've been thinking," Eliza said, her shoulder pressed against his. "About how we started." "About our arrangement." Jacob tensed slightly. "Having regrets?" "No, not regrets." She turned to look at him, and in the fading light her gray eyes were soft. "I've been thinking about how we married for practical reasons. To save the farm, to survive. We said maybe love would come later or maybe it wouldn't, and that would be okay." "I remember," Jacob said quietly. "Well, I don't think we need to wait anymore to know." Eliza took his hand, intertwining their fingers. "I love you, Jacob Morrison. Not because you saved my farm or because we're good partners, though we are. I love you because of who you are. Because you're kind and patient. Because you still talk to Rose sometimes and you don't think I notice. Because you laugh at my terrible singing. Because you see me, really see me, and you don't try to change what you see." Jacob felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Eliza, You don't have to say it back," she interrupted quickly. "I just wanted you to know. I wanted to be honest about what this has become for me." "Let me finish," Jacob said gently. He stood and pulled her up with him, holding both her hands in his. "I love you too. I've loved you since that day in the storm. When you stood in your kitchen soaking wet and proposed the craziest, most practical, most perfect solution to both our problems. I've loved you through every awkward dinner and every comfortable silence. I've loved you watching you work, watching you fight for what's yours, watching you slowly let me in." Eliza's eyes filled with tears. "Really?" "Really." Jacob pulled her close. "We did this backwards, didn't we? Marriage first, then dating, then falling in love. But I wouldn't change it. This strange, unconventional, completely backwards way we've done things has given me something I never thought I'd have again. A home, a partner, a future worth living." They kissed as the sun set behind them, painting the sky in brilliant reds and golds. It wasn't their first kiss or even their 100th, but it was different. It was a kiss between two people who'd chosen each other not once, but continuously, every day, in small ways and large. When they finally pulled apart, Eliza laughed through her tears. What would the town say if they knew the scandalous couple actually fell in love? "Let them talk," Jacob said, echoing her words from months ago. "We've got more important things to worry about."